my world, and that's a good thing because it's always a beautiful day in my consciousness. Right. Well, here we are. We're nearing the end of the series we've been doing about our 5 basic unity principles, and today we are on number 4, which is about prayer. So here is what our 4th principle has to say. Prayer is creative thinking that heightens the connection with God mind and therefore brings forth wisdom, healing, prosperity, and everything good. One of the things I've been emphasizing over the past few weeks is that these principles were never meant to become a statement of faith or some kind of an orthodox creed. And that means that we have the freedom to change the wording. As long as we are in integrity with the basic intent of the principle, we can change the wording. For example, that concept of God-mind up there might not be familiar to us. Or some of you may be having I like to call it an allergic reaction to the word God because it carries some baggage with it, and perhaps you can no longer deal with the image of God as the bearded guy in the sky. And if that's an issue for you, change the word. Not to worry, change it. Substitute something like principle, spirit, source, natural law. Use whatever word or phrase that for you best describes how you experience the intangible side of reality. We're free to do that. Something else that might not be familiar to you about that principle is talking about prayer as creative thinking. It's quite a bit different from what I learned when I was growing up. To me, prayer, as I remember it, was all about asking for things from God. Not just asking, but sometimes begging for things. And not just begging for things, but sometimes even cutting a deal. I tried to cut a deal once to get a puppy. I said, "Oh, please, God, let me have a puppy, and I promise I'll make my bed every single day." I didn't get my first puppy until I was 51. So I figure since I had to wait so long, I don't have to make my bed. That's only fair, right? Yep. Everybody has a different way of praying. Anybody remember a little fellow by the name of Calvin and his tiger buddy Hobbes? Yeah. Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin has a very different way of praying. Calvin has his own version of the Serenity Prayer. Up here he's talking to Hobbes and he says, "Know what I pray for?" And Hobbes says, "What?" And Calvin says, "I pray for the strength to change what I can, the inability to accept what I can't, and the incapacity to tell the difference." And Hobbes has a very wise comment. Hobbes says, "You should lead an interesting life." And Calvin says, "Oh, I already do. I'll bet. No, we are not here to tell you that you have to change the way you pray, okay? If you have something that works for you, if you pray to God or as God or whatever works for you, go with it. What we want to offer is an alternative. An expanded understanding. If the idea of petitioning God is something that doesn't work for you or it's something that you don't believe in, then we're going to offer another option. And we call it affirmative prayer. This is what our co-founder Charles Fillmore had to say on the subject of affirmative prayer. Understanding shows that prayer is more than asking God for help in this physical world. Actually, we have become a human race of praying beggars. Prayer is not supplication or begging. It is more than supplication. Supplication is impotent. Do not supplicate or beg God to give you what you need. Prayer is a simple asking for that which we know is waiting for us and an affirmation of its existence. So there is an aspect of asking in there, and that's okay, but it's more than that. And I love that line in there. We've become a human race of praying beggars. So we have to watch our language. Charles is describing what we call affirmative prayer. And this is something that I think flows naturally from the first three principles that we've been talking about. Now that we've arrived at principle number 4, we can begin to see how these principles are interrelated, how they tie together, and how one builds upon the other. We started out with our first principle, which says God is absolute good everywhere present. All right, if that is true, if God is everywhere present and is absolute good, then that means that there has to be a presence of God or the presence of God within us, because it's everywhere, which leads us into the second principle, which says that human beings have a spark of divinity within them, the Christ Spirit within. Their very essence is of God, and therefore they are also inherently good. That spark of divinity means that we have a lot more power than we like to admit. We have more power than we often want to give ourselves credit for. And that leads into our third principle, which says that human beings create their experiences by the activity of their thinking. Everything in the manifest realm has its beginning in thought. That's power. We share the creative power of spirit, which is how we shape our experience of life by the activity of our thought. Okay, so if our habitual patterns of thinking actually shape our experience of life, then it might be a real good idea to cultivate healthy patterns of thinking, which takes us right into our fourth principle, which says that prayer is creative thinking that heightens the connection with God-mind and therefore brings forth wisdom, healing, prosperity, and everything good. When these 5 principles were formulated, I'm not sure if they really intended them to dovetail like this and build on each other, but there it is. That's what happens. That's what happens. So creative thinking that brings forth wisdom, healing, prosperity, and everything good. That's affirmative prayer. And that brings us to our question for the day, which is, does it work? Does prayer work? Well, it all depends on what you mean by the word work. There have been all sorts of scientific studies. They try to put prayer under a microscope and test it in the laboratory. And there have been all sorts of mixed results from these studies, but the one that got the most attention happened back in 2006. And when they released the results from this study, there was a headline out there which read, "Prayer doesn't help patient recovery. Score 1 for godless science." Very provocative, right? The study was known as STEP, and that's an acronym that stands for Study of the Therapeutic Effects of Intercessory Prayers. This study involved 3 Christian prayer groups who prayed for a group of over 3,000 heart bypass patients. The prayer was for a successful surgery with a quick, healthy recovery. Then the researchers would keep track of any post-surgical complications in all these patients. One group was told that they were being prayed for, and the others didn't know. The end result, there was no decrease in complications compared to the national average for the whole group. And the group that actually knew that it was being prayed for, well, they actually had a slight increase in complications. So what do we make of that? Well, I think this points up one of the biggest problems with this kind of study, which is that prayer, at least as we approach it, is not about putting somebody under a microscope and treating them like a microbe. It's not supposed to be cold, sterile, and indifferent. The group that knew that they were being prayed for, they consented to it, but it's not like they were sitting there engaged in the process with somebody who was praying with them in person or praying with them on the phone and actually engaging their consciousness in the process. That's a bit of a problem. When we randomize it, when we take out the human element and that element of contact and the engagement and the interaction, we're going to lose something. There's a story about a group of passengers on an airplane. And the airplane is encountering some severe turbulence. So the pilot gets on the speaker and he tells everyone to sit down, fasten your seatbelts, we're going to be getting into some turbulence. And pretty soon the roller coaster ride starts and the plane is bucking and rocking back and forth, and there was this one passenger who happened to be sitting next to a minister. And the minister could tell that this passenger was freaking out. This passenger was starting to panic. Death grip on the armrest, beads of sweat on the forehead, hyperventilating, and the minister leans over very gently and says, "Would you like to pray?" And the guy immediately throws his hands in the air and he says, "Oh my God, has it come to that? Is it that bad? We're all going to die." And isn't that the way it goes sometimes? You know, imagine having a few folks like that in that group of people that were told that they were being prayed for, and they're thinking, "Oh my God, is it that bad that somebody has to actually pray for me?" Do you think that's going to increase their stress level or decrease their stress level? And is stress good for a person trying to recover from bypass surgery or bad? If the experiment is building stress into the process, it's kind of hard to put the blame on prayer in these situations. And part of the problem is that our culture has this tendency to look at prayer as a last resort. We look at it as a last resort instead of this natural process of creative and affirmative thinking. That's a shift that's going to have to happen. And one of the ways that Unity is hopefully starting to bring that shift about is by a book that came out late last year by Unity minister Linda Martella Whitsitt. I love the title. It says, "How to Pray Without Talking to God. Moment by moment, choice by choice. How to pray without talking to God." And it's all about affirmative prayer. We're using this book in our chaplain training now. It's a great little book, and this is what she has to say about affirmative prayer. Affirmative prayer does not involve begging a distant God to change ourselves, other people, or our circumstances. Affirmative prayer does the following. It cultivates our awareness of oneness, the one power and presence and divine mind. We pray from a consciousness of God. And then I added the parenthetical there. We pray from a consciousness of God instead of from a consciousness of a problem or something that we think we lack. Affirmative prayer identifies divine nature as our true nature. We claim our divine identity. And affirmative prayer reveals the highest truth we can comprehend in this moment. We realize the truth. Prayer is a consciousness conditioning tool. One of the things that really caught my attention when I first started attending a Unity Center was a class that I took called Life of Prayer. That was the first time that somebody explained to me that the purpose of prayer is to change one thing and one thing only: our present level of consciousness. That's what it's about. Here's an example. This is an example of the difference between praying from a consciousness of lack or from a consciousness of a problem and affirmative prayer. And this deals with a student who's facing, let's say, a math test, all right? So here's the first prayer that I'm calling the somewhat less than affirmative prayer, where the student is saying, "Oh God, in your mercy, pity me, give me the strength to do well on my math test, help my mind to be clear and my memory not fail me." It's not a terrible prayer. That's nothing terrible about it, but let's take a look at the affirmative version of the very same thing. I am one with Spirit, God, principle, whatever word you want to put in there. I am one with God. Strength and intelligence flow through me now so that my mind is clear, my thoughts are focused, and I remember all that I need to know. I will do well on this math test because principle never fails. Okay. All right. Which words make you feel a little bit more calm and confident about the situation that you're about to face? In the first example, we're trying to persuade someone or something outside of ourselves to give us something that we think we are lacking. We are praying from a consciousness that we're lacking something. In the second example, we're closing the gap. We aren't praying to something that's outside of us. We pray from an awareness. We speak from an awareness of our true nature, our second principle, and then we make a bold statement of truth which affirms that we already have whatever it is that we need to deal with the outer circumstances. That's a little more empowering to me. Unity author Eric Butterworth, who is very well known for his book, Discover the Power Within You, has another way of formulating this idea that I want to share with you also. He talks about asking again, and asking is okay, but he says, you ask for your good in the sense of claiming your inheritance. A good worker who comes in early and leaves late, who always tries to improve his performance and to help the company, is asking for promotion. And it usually comes because he has created conditions that make that result inevitable. You ask for life by affirming life. You ask for success by getting in the consciousness of success. And you can just keep going on with that. You ask for health by getting in the consciousness of health. The purpose of prayer then is to affirm in our consciousness that which is true of God and of our relationship with God. That's what it's all about. What we need to do is to get into a habitual pattern of creative thinking so that we are constantly in the process of creating the things that we want more of in our lives. And that might require a subtle shift in the way that we've been thinking about prayer. Here's a few ways to do that. You can pick up the book that we've been talking about, How to Pray Without Talking to God. She gives a lot of exercises in there looking at ways to change our wording and change very subtly the way that we think about prayer and the way we go about it. Or we have prayer chaplains here. They're trained to pray with you using affirmative prayer. So that's another resource with you to have that engaged, that personally engaged kind of prayer that I was talking about earlier. Or you can try this. Call Silent Unity, 1-800-NOW-PRAY. For those of you who are maybe new to Unity, Silent Unity is our international prayer ministry that's headquartered in Lee's Summit outside of Kansas City, Missouri. They are on the phone lines 24/7 every single day of the year, and they've been doing that for over 100 years. They get I think it's well over 1 million phone calls a year now that they're logging. They are masters in the art of affirmative prayer, and they will simply ask you what your prayer need is, whether it's for healing or whatever it is, and then they will support you, and they will give you an example of what that affirmative prayer sounds like. And just remember that there's one more step in the process that we haven't talked about yet. Our student who's facing the math test has prayed affirmatively, and he or she is experiencing that shift in consciousness. She's calm, she's focused. There's one more thing that he or she has to do. What's that? Study, yes. Prayer isn't magic. There's usually an action step that's involved at the end of it. That's our fifth principle, putting it all into action. And we'll talk some more about that next week. Hope to see you then. Thank you.